Father Gregory Boyle is a Jesuit priest, renowned speaker, humanitarian, writer, and founder and executive director of the Los Angeles-based Homeboy Industries. He launched Homeboy Bakery in 1992 as a response to the civil unrest in Los Angeles with a mission to create an environment that provided training, work experience, and above all, the opportunity for rival gang members to work side by side. The success of the bakery created the groundwork for additional businesses. Today, Homeboy Industries' nonprofit economic development enterprises include Homeboy Bakery, Homeboy Diner at Los Angeles City Hall, Homeboy Farmers Markets, Homeboy Silkscreen and Embroidery, Homeboy and Homegirl Merchandise, and Homegirl Cafe and Catering. He's an acknowledged expert on gangs, intervention, and reentry, and he has received numerous accolades, recognitions, and honorary degrees for his work on behalf of Homeboy and with former gang members. Chadwick is particularly happy to welcome Father Greg because not only is he a terrific representation of the Round Square ideals, but he also embodies our conference's leadership mission. As he shares with us the complexities of some local Los Angeles issues, I hope we are inspired to confront the complexities of the problems that plague our communities worldwide. Poverty, hunger, violence, though each has global significance, there is no clear-cut, simple solution. Through his faith and leadership, Father Greg Boyle shows that an immense amount of good can be done with a commitment to addressing the problems in one's own community. His leadership by example has touched so many people and changed so many lives. Please join me in welcoming Father Greg Boyle.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be with you. I've given a lot of talks kind of in this area over at the church and over at the retreat house, so I apologize if some of you have heard me before, but maybe you guys haven't, so it happens. A couple summers ago, I spoke at a foster grandparent gathering, huge thing in Southern California. Well, I had spoken at it the summer before. I don't know why they invited me 2 summers in a row, but there you have it. And afterwards, this foster grandmother came up to me, and I think she liked my talk. She had big tears in her eyes, and she grabbed my hands, and she said, "I heard you last year. It never gets better." So anyway, I kind of hope she misspoke there, but not entirely sure. So, you know, I represent a kind of a group that deals with folks on the margins, folks who are always hoping to fall into the notice of God and you. I had a 16-year-old gang member, very earnest kid, standing in front of my desk. He says, "Look, I need your divided attention." And I said, "You are in luck, because that's exactly what I have today, you know, so." I think there's a vision that brings you to this time and together, and it's not just about leadership. You know, leadership is for something. I mean, this gathering has a purpose. Martin Luther King used to say about church, it's not the place you come to, it's the place you go from. So you're going to go from this place and armed with a vision. You want to have a vision. In the end, you want the world to look differently than it currently looks, and good for you. The prophet Habakkuk writes, "The vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, wait for it." But none of us want to wait for too long, you know, con los brazos cruzados, you know, tapping our feet and staring at our watches. You want to make something happen. So here's what you have to, I think, the point of leadership is to make this one thing happen. You want to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly, I think, when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? How do we together imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside of it? And so to that end, we all in our own way find the ways to dismantle the barriers that exclude. How do we inch our way out to the very edges to stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless? to stand with those whose dignity has been denied, and stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. In your own service, you've had this experience of being able once in a while to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. I think if kinship was our goal in your own leadership, we wouldn't be promoting justice, we'd be celebrating it. So for 27 years, I've been working with gang members, and they've taught me everything of value, and I'm grateful. But in the last couple of years, they've taught me how to text, and I just couldn't be more grateful to them. Because I find it sure beats the heck out of actually talking to people. And so I'm pretty good at it, LOL and OMG and BTW, you know, and the homies have taught me a new one, OHN, which apparently stands for, oh, hell no. And I've been using that one quite a bit lately. So there I am in a car with two homies, older vatos named Manuel and Poncho, tattooed, been to prison. And they're going to help me give a talk at a high school and in Palm Desert. So we meet at 9, which is when everybody gathers. I have 300 employees. And so we start to drive, and Manuel's in the front seat. And all of a sudden he gets an incoming, text, and he kind of reads it, and he kind of chuckles to himself. And I said, well, what is it? He goes, oh, it's dumb. It's from Snoopy back at the office. Well, I'd just seen Snoopy. Snoopy gave me a big abrazote as the day began. Snoopy and Manuel work in the clock-in room where they clock in hundreds and hundreds of our workers. It's a tough job, actually. And I said, well, what's he say? Oh, it's dumb. Hang on. Hey, dog, it's me, Snoops. Yeah, they got my ass locked up at county jail. They're charging me with being the ugliest vato in America. You have to come down right now, show them they got the wrong guy. Well, we died laughing, and then I realized that Manuel and Snoopy are enemies from rival gangs. They used to shoot bullets at each other. Now they shoot text messages. And there's a word for that, and the word is kinship. How do we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we're separate, that there is an us and a them? How do we stand against forgetting that we belong to each other? Service is a great thing, and eloquently articulated just minutes ago. But it's the starting point. You never want to end there, because service is the hallway that leads to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom. You don't want to stay in the hallway. And the ballroom is kinship. That's the place of great union. Because there's a distance even in service provider, service recipient. And you don't want there to be a distance. You always want to bridge it. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and that gang member over there is in need of my exquisite healing. The truth is, we're all in need of healing. All of us are a cry for help. Welcome to the human race. So you want to bridge even that distance where there is no us and them, a high moral distance that separates us. No homie found more jobs through Homeboy Industries than this guy, Caesar, kind of a knucklehead growing up in the projects and got into a gang, and then he, would get into trouble and locked up. And he'd get out, and I'd find him a job either out in the world or with us. But he'd always kind of gravitate back to vague criminality, stuff usually involving drugs, the use of or the sale of. But he was a smart kid with a dangerous sense of humor. And so this one time he finished 4 months probation violation, and there he is sitting in front of my desk. And he says what gang members often say, "This time it'll be different." I go, all right. So I call up a friend of mine with him right there, a friend who runs a vending machine company in Alhambra, California. And this guy had hired homies before, so, and he does again. He says, have him start tomorrow. And so Caesar begins work at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again, sitting in front of my desk. Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go. But this time, he pulls out of his pocket his very first paycheck at the vending machine company, and he says, damn, gee, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job. And I said, well, gosh, who? And he looks at me kind of strangely, and he says, well, God, of course. Oh, sure, no, that's right, that would be God, yeah. He said, you thought I was going to say you. I said, no, gosh, no, God's number one, yeah. He said, you are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days. And I said, I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now, he said. Yeah. We just fell out of our chairs, dissolved in laughter. Suddenly kinship so quickly. And I ask you, who's the service provider and who's the service recipient? I don't know. It's mutual. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend. And I remember once a reporter had commented to him and said, wow, these farm workers, they sure love you. And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, the feeling's mutual. That's the point of leadership. You want to get to that place of exquisite mutuality, union, kinship. That's the whole point. Your time together is not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from to do exactly that. So Homeboy Industries was born 25 years ago when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, Dolores Mission, nestled in the middle of two public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village, the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, making it, according to the Los Angeles Police Department, the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole world was my parish. I didn't know this. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988. And I buried my 186th yesterday morning, a young man named David. We all called him Tito. I knew him all his life. So we did a lot of things in those days. But the first thing we did was we started a school, because there were gang members out there exactly your age who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. And they were selling drugs and violent and wreaking havoc. So I walked out to them and I said, hey, if I could find a school that would take you, would you go? Every single one said, yeah. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so that kind of forced my hand. So I went to the convent where the nuns lived, which was on the 3rd floor of our elementary school, and I gathered them and I said, hey, would you guys mind, like moving out, and I don't know, we could turn the convent into a school, and they said, sure, go nuns, nice going. And so we found a house in the neighborhood, and we started a school for gang members on the 3rd floor of our elementary school. And that brought gang members to the church, and that created a kind of a disconnect, upset the apple cart. Aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed, good people in and bad people out? So that kind of challenged us in a good way. And then the gang members said, if only we had jobs. And so myself and the women in the parish, we marched all around the factories that surrounded the housing projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So we couldn't wait any longer. So by 1992, I went to a movie producer who had $500 million. He didn't give me all of that, but not by a long shot. But I said, hey, buy a bakery, this old abandoned bakery across the street from the church. We'll call it Homeboy Bakery, and gang members, enemies can work side by side baking bread. Well, he liked the idea, so he bought the bakery. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market in downtown LA. Once we had plural, we came up with the highfalutin name Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this. Not everything worked. I'll be the very first person to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing was really not hugely successful, you know. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And you never intend to become this, but we backed our way right into it. We have become now the largest gang intervention, rehab, and reentry program in the United States. So 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors. There are 1,100 gangs in LA County, 120,000 gang members, because it's sort of a daunting, complex social dilemma. And we offer anything that you might think would be helpful. A lot of curricular things to all our 200 trainees and people off the street as well. Anger management, parenting, grief and loss, yoga, lots of classes. We still have a school. We have free tattoo removal. No place on the planet Earth removes more tattoos than we do. 3 laser machines, 30 volunteer doctors, 10,000 treatments a year. So I know there must be somebody here who's starting to regret their Chadwick tattoo you have. So see me afterwards. There's no questions asked. We have all our chips and salsas in the Ralph's here in Southern California. We just opened a restaurant in the American Airlines terminal at LAX. Homeboy Diner is the only place you can get food at City Hall in Los Angeles. Homeboy Silkscreen. Homeboy Homegirl Merchandise, where we sell our logo stuff online and in our retail store. Homeboy Bakery still exists. We're in 24 farmers markets. We have 4 mini farms that provide produce for our restaurants. We have solar panel installation training program. We have lots of therapists. Everybody's in therapy. 6 paid therapists and 40 volunteer therapists. Case managers, what am I missing? Oh, and Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order. And they cater. They've even come out this way. My favorite story of perhaps all time happened when Oscar-winning actress Diane Keaton came for lunch one day. She won an Academy Award for Annie Hall, and she was in all the Godfather movies, big movie star. She comes with a regular, a guy who's there once a week, and her waitress this day is Glenda. And Glenda's a homegirl, been there, done that, tattooed, been to prison, felon, parolee. She doesn't know who Diane Keaton is, so she's taking her orders, and Diane Keaton says, well, what do you recommend? And Glenda rattles off the 3 platillos that she particularly likes, and Diane Keaton says, oh, I'll have that second one. That one sounds good. And it's at that moment something dawns on Glenda. You know, she looks at Diane Keaton, she goes, wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere, like maybe we've met. And Diane Keaton decides to sort of deflect it humbly. Oh, gosh, I don't know. I suppose I have one of those faces, you know, that people think they've seen before. And then Glenda goes, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Honest to God, that just took my breath away when I heard it. And I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind, and if you'll permit me to propose what is on God's mind. Jesus says with some clarity to the gathered folk, that you may be one. He suggests that's the end of leadership, our own union, our own kinship, our own connection, our own obliterating of the illusion that we're separate. No us and them, just us. All of us are called, but especially leaders, to be what Alice Miller, the late great child psychologist, called enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love, return people to themselves. You don't hold the bar up and ask anybody to measure up, never. You just hold the mirror up and you tell people the truth, knowing that your truth is my truth, and my truth is a gang member's truth. And the gang member's truth is everybody's truth, and here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. Then you watch folks, especially those on the margins, as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth, and no bullet can pierce it, no four prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it. And this kid Tito that I buried yesterday knew the truth of who he was, and death can't touch it. But you have to reach in and dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way. The principal suffering of the poor throughout history is shame and disgrace. Lately, I've been taking a leisurely stroll through the Acts of the Apostles, and I suppose you could see it as a quaint snapshot of life in the early Christian community, or you can read it as the measure of health in any community and the goal of leadership. Things will leap off the page. See how they love one another. That's a pretty good measure. There's nobody needy here in this community. That's an excellent one. My favorite one, though, just leapt off the page, and it was this. And awe came upon everyone. That it would seem that the measure of the health of the communities in which you will be leaders will be measured in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. Some time ago, I was invited to do an in-service or training all day from 9 to 3 in Richmond, Virginia, for 600 social workers on gangs. So I didn't know how I was going to fill the whole day, so I brought two homies with me. Andres, who just had a baby, just texted me the picture of his baby, African-American gang member who worked for me at the time, and a homie named Jose in his late 20s, gang member, tattooed, been to prison, but he also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. And then he worked up from our janitorial crew, and it was a member of our substance abuse team trying to help the younger homies stay sober and in recovery, help heal them. So he got up to give his talk, and I'd never heard his story before. And he began kind of in an offhanded way. Hey, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, "Why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me." Well, 600 social workers, they gasped. And then he said, "It sounds way worser in Spanish," he said to them, and we needed a laugh 1 minute in. He said, "I guess I was 9 when my mom drove me to the deepest part of Baja California. She walks me up to an orphanage and she says, 'I found this kid.' And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 T-shirts to school every day. The first T-shirt, because the blood would seep through, and the second T-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third T-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 T-shirts? Then he started to get overwhelmed by the emotion of it, and he just stopped speaking. And he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. I wore 3 T-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. Well, now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of your compassion lies not in your service of those on the margins, but in your willingness to see yourself in kinship with them. Have you guys heard of Dr. Phil? Yeah. Well, there I was on the Dr. Phil show. I know. What was I thinking? But he was going to promote my book and talk for an hour on national TV about Homeboy Industries. I thought, well, how bad can this be? And so I hear my name being announced backstage by Dr. Phil. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the founder and director of Homeboy Industries, Father Greg Boyle. And so I walk out there, and to my horror, on a stage like this with an audience, and everybody's clapping. There he is sitting in his stool in the middle of the stage, and my empty stool is next to him awaiting me. But on his side of the stage is a beautiful, gorgeous mahogany coffin. On my side of the stage is a perfectly reconstructed jail cell with bars and bed and sink and toilet. They went to great expense for these set pieces. You already know where this is going to go. So the producers fly in 3 unsuspecting young males, 14, 15, 16, an African-American, a Latino, and a white kid. And so they fly them in from different parts of the country with their distraught single mothers. And each kid has sort of gravitated perilously close to gang involvement. And so one kid at a time comes out, and he sort of grabs them figuratively, not literally, but he kind of grabs them and he says, "Don't you see where this choice of yours is leading you? To death or to prison?" Well, finally, by the 3rd kid, I felt I needed to say something. I go, "Phil, how do I break this to you? These kids know this better than we do. They're not waiting for more information. They know this will lead to death or to prison. They don't care whether it will. This is about a lethal absence of hope. Nobody in this room or outside of it has ever met a hopeful kid who joined a gang. Never, not once. It's never happened. Hopeful kids don't join gangs. In fact, gangs are the places kids go when they've encountered their life as a misery, and who doesn't know by now that misery loves company? And no kid in the end is seeking anything when he joins a gang. He's always fleeing something, no exceptions. You want to get the diagnosis right, because nobody's ever met a good treatment plan that was born of a bad diagnosis. Years ago, I had leukemia and went through chemotherapy, feeling pretty good at the moment. Or as the homies still say, I hear your cancer's in intermission. I said, yes, apparently it's stepped up to the lobby to buy some popcorn. May the line be long. But I went to a doctor who misdiagnosed me. He said I had mononucleosis, so he treated me for that for a year. Well, bad diagnosis isn't neutral. I don't think. I think it does damage, waste time, it's costly. That's why you want to get it right. Whenever you're a leader and you want to diagnose something correctly, you want to get it right. Otherwise, you walk down a path that won't lead to happy results. Somebody was asking, a reporter was asking me about when I had cancer, and I was telling him I wouldn't trade that period of my life for anything. Because in the end, you want to connect. And I never had an experience like that, so deep and full of connecting with other human beings. The news got announced on the front page of the LA Times, Sunday LA Times, that I had cancer, and pretty soon gang members came out of the woodwork, and people would fill up my voicemail, a homegirl named China. Now it's our turn to take care of you. Very sweet. I had a huge homie named Grumpy, 6'4", standing in front of my desk, big tears in his eyes, and apparently God had forgotten to give him a neck, and he was standing there, and he said, "What do I have that you need?" Meaning organs. And I was really happy to tell him I didn't need any of his organs, but it was the thought that counted. One of my favorites was a little 15-year-old gang member who came into my office kind of late in the game. I was already going through my chemotherapy treatments. And so he came in, and after chemo, I always would come back to the office because I'd rather kick it there than at home. And he comes in, and he sits down, and he looks so stricken. And he says, "I hear you have leukemia." I said, "Yeah, I do." And there's this awkward silence. "My cat had leukemia," he said. "Yeah, she died." And I said, "Oh, gosh, I'm sorry to hear that. I am awfully glad you stopped by." I picked me right up there. But my all-time favorite was a homie named Crazy Ace. We called him Loco. And Loco called me from jail, collect. And he had just read this in the Sunday LA Times, and he said, "Hey, what's up with this leukemia anyway?" I said, "Well, it's cancer. It's in the blood. The doctors say my white count's too high." Them doctors, they don't be knowing nothing. I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, hello, of course your white count's high." So anyway, and suddenly kinship so quickly, though others might call it a second opinion. I'd like to call it kinship. I've written a book called Tattoos on the Heart, and I'm happy sometimes when universities will call me and say, "We've forced our students to read the book." And so if they invite me to speak, I go. And so I went to my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington. And I brought two homies with me, and I'm about to go to D.C. on Saturday to give a couple talks there. If I can do it and people will pay for it, I bring homies. I always choose homies who have never been on a plane, just because I love the thrill of seeing them terrified. And I always bring enemies, just so that they can share a hotel room together, just to mess with them a little bit, So I brought two homies with me: Bobby, African-American gang member who worked in my bakery, and a kid, Mario, who worked in my retail store. I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times, homeboys, homegirls, in my life, I've never taken anybody so terrified of flying than this guy Mario, completely unexpected. He was just hyperventilating, and we hadn't even gotten on the plane yet, So we flew out of Burbank Airport, which is kind of a smaller airport, and so it's kind of big bay windows. You can see the plane right up there, and there's no hermetically sealed chute. You walk out onto the tarmac like the President of the United States, and you climb up the stairs to get in the plane, like the front of the plane and the back of the plane. And we're sitting there, and here comes our plane. It's early morning, and our plane, here's our plane, and Mario, and I go, oh God, he may actually die before we get on the plane. And so everybody gets off the plane, and then I see our flight attendants, females, getting on the plane, walking, schlepping up the stairs with big, huge cups of Starbucks coffee. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? And I said, oh, as soon as they sober up the pilots. Here they go now. I know I probably shouldn't have said that, but I should tell you that Mario, out of any of the thousands of gang members who ever worked there, he's the most tattooed. He's completely covered, all sleeved out, his whole neck, most of his face, except for a little circle that, his mouth, nose, and eyes, but covered in tattoos. I'd never been in public with him. So we're walking in the airport, and people are going like this, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely, And I think, wow, that's interesting, because if you asked anybody at Homeboy Industries, say, who's the kindest, most gentle gang member here? Every single one would say, oh, well, Mario, who works in the store. Everyone would say that. He's so kind, and he's so effusive in his gratitude. And even on the plane, for as terrified as he was, the flight attendant would hand him peanuts, and he would not just take them, and he wouldn't just thank her. He'd grab her hand, and he'd look her in the eyes, and he'd say, thank you so much. And it was really kind of odd, but he was like that the whole trip. So we get to Gonzaga, and I'm going to give a big talk at night. And then, of course, they tell you, oh, well, we've got this talk and this talk and this talk and this class and this lunch and this talk. So they planned all these little talks, and I went to the two of them. You guys speak, and I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom because I'm talking tonight. So they were nervous, but they got up and they told their story, and sometimes you don't know you have a story until you tell one, until you tell yours. And their stories were hard to hear: torture and pain and suffering and abandonment and abuse. Honest to God, if their stories had been aflame, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. So I told them that I would speak like for 45 minutes. And afterwards, I wanted them to each give a little 5-minute snapshot so I could include them in the question and answer. And so the talk, it was just packed. It was like 1,000 people, standing room only, students sitting on the floor. It was just, violation of fire code, And so I did my 45 minutes. Each one got up, Mario and Bobby, and they did their 5 minutes. And I said, okay, questions. And a woman over here, she stands, and she says, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out of the gate is for Mario. And he stands up to the microphone, yes. And he's just terrified. He's just this tall, skinny guy. And she says, well, you say you're a father, and you have a daughter and a son, and they're about to enter their teenage years. What advice do you give them? What wisdom do you impart to them? Mario thinks for a while, and he closes his eyes, and he's getting a hernia trying to come up with the right answer, and he doesn't know exactly what to say when suddenly he blurts out, then he catches himself, and he begins to crumble and cry, but he wants to get the sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence. Until the woman who asked the question stands up and she says, it's her turn now to battle her own tears. And she says, "Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you." And 1,000 people stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And I think that's the only praise God has any interest in. It's mutual. One last story, because you've had a long day. So have I. People always ask me about enemies working together, and it's kind of tough at first. A homie will come in and say, "I'm ready, ready, ready," and I'll say, "Well, okay, I have an opening in the bakery, but you have to work with X, Y, and Z." And I rattle off the names of rivals, enemies. They always do the same thing, they think for a long-ass time, and then they go, "Okay, I'll work with them. I'm not going to talk to them." This used to bother me in the early days, until you discover that it's impossible for human beings to demonize people they know. You can't really pull it off. So I had a homie everybody called Youngster. That was his gang name. Little tiny guy, a little chaparrito. And I brought him to our Homeboy silkscreen factory, our biggest business. And I'm going to introduce him to his coworkers. I thought he was ready to begin. And I watch him as he shakes hands with every single one, looks them in the eye. Even enemies, I think, wow, this is great. Until Youngster gets to the last guy, and the last guy seems to be wanting to avoid this encounter altogether. A kid everybody called Puppet. And when Puppet and Youngster are in each other's vicinity, they mumble something, they stare at their shoes, they don't shake hands. Well, I know they're enemies because I know what gangs they're from, but he just finished shaking hands with other enemies. I discover later that this is a hatred that's really personal and deep, beyond which neither of them think they can get past. So I sensed that much at the moment. I said, "Look, if you guys can't hang working together, let me know. I got a bunch of people who want this job." Calladitos, they don't say a word. Well, 6 months later, Puppet walks to a store some distance from his home, one of those little corner stores, and he buys something. And walking home, he decides to take a shortcut, so he dodges into an alley. And because he's taken this detour, suddenly, unexpectedly, he's surrounded by 10 members of a rival gang, 10 against 1, and they beat him badly. And while he's lying on the ground, they will not stop kicking his head until he's lifeless. Somebody finds his body and takes him to White Memorial Hospital, where he's declared effectively brain dead. But it's the policy there to keep you connected to machines for 48 hours, so you can get 2 straight days of a flat read without any brain activity, and then the doctors sign the death certificate. This allowed family and friends to gather. I was at St. Louis University giving a talk. I flew home immediately. I've seen a lot of horrible things in my life, but nothing to compare to the sight of this young man with his head swollen many times its size. It was horrifying. You could barely train your eyes on him. So at the end of the 48-hour period, I gave him a blessing as a priest, and I anointed his forehead with oil. We disconnected. A week later, I buried him. But in the first 24 hours, as he was lying beaten in the hospital, I was alone in my office. It was 8:30 at night, and the phone rings, and it's Youngster, Puppet's co-worker from the silkscreen. "Hey," he says, That's messed up about what happened to Puppet. I said, yeah, it is. And then with a certain kind of eagerness even, he says, is there anything I can do? Can I give him my blood? And we both fall silent under the weight of it, until finally he breaks the silence, choking back his tears, and he says with great deliberation, he was not my enemy. He was my friend. We worked together. Now, can I say that always happens at Homeboy Industries? Yes, of course. Any exceptions? No, not a single one. And it shouldn't surprise us that God's own dream come true for us. That we be one just happens to be our own deepest longing for ourselves. For it turns out, indeed, it's mutual. This gathering is not the place you've come to. It is the place you go from to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. For the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, we wait for it. Thank you very much.